Welcome, folks. Welcome to the first webinar on calculating the living wage. It looks like there's almost 50 of you on the line. We're delighted to have you join us. This webinar will run for an hour. There's lots of time at the end for questions, and you'll be hearing from three of us throughout the presentation. The webinar itself is divided into 4 content sections. The first will be a brief history of the campaign. The second part will be how the living wage is calculated. The third will be some advice we have on finding a local agency to help you do a local calculation. And the fourth part is we'll actually get into the details of a local calculation so that any questions you have about where to find data will be answered. And of course there will be time at the end for questions. So Adrienne Montani, who's in the middle of the trio here, will cover the history of the campaign and how to find a local agency. Adrienne is the provincial coordinator of First Call and was part of the development of the Living Wage for Families campaign. And then Iglika Ivanova, who is on my right, I guess your left, an economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, will go over how the wage is calculated and then walk us all through the details of those calculations. Iglika does the annual calculation of the living wage rate in Metro Vancouver, and she also generously helps check the wage rates for other areas, including the rate that the Community Planning Council in Victoria does and that Vibrant Abbotsford does. And I'm Catherine Ludgate. I work at Van City Credit Union, living wage employer, and I've been lent part-time to the Living Wage Families campaign to encourage more employers to join this campaign. Thank you very much for joining us, and then we'll move over to you, Adrienne.
So thank you, Catherine. Welcome, everybody. So who are we? Well, I'll start with First Call, BC Child and Youth Advocacy Coalition, where I work. We are the lead partner in Campaign 2000. Some of you may be familiar with the campaign. It's a national campaign, anti-child poverty campaign. And one of the things we do is we monitor child and family poverty every year by producing a child poverty report card. We do the BC report card. So over the years, when we looked at the data on child poverty, what we found was that a significant number of parents or poor children are living with parents who are in the paid workforce. And in fact, a significant portion of those each year have at least one parent working full-time, full year, all year round. So of course, the data then pointed us to the importance of addressing low wages if we want to tackle child poverty. So in 2006, as part of a Campaign 2000 project that was looking at the plight of young families in Canada in particular, we began research on the potential community support for living wage standards in BC. We did some outreach workshops, first conducted with some low-income families in Metro Vancouver, to get some input on what did their realistic family expenses look like. We convened a living wage roundtable with representation again from parents, from union groups, from faith groups, from business groups, other community organizations, to begin a community dialogue about is there interest in and support for launching a living wage movement in this province, or at least in the Lower Mainland. I have to say the interest and enthusiasm was palpable. People showed up in huge numbers at the roundtables, and offers of help started springing up. So we concluded the idea did have some legs, and there was wide appeal to get this going, especially as a strategy for addressing child poverty. So the next year, First Call collaborated with the CCPA, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and the Victoria Community Social Planning Council to convene we called it the ACAD group, but we convened a research group to articulate the principles underlying living wage campaign and hammer out a methodology for the calculation for living wage baselines in Victoria and Vancouver. This joint research group included, again, academics from local universities, the United Way of the Lower Mainland, some social planning councils and others, and also trade unions, in particular the Hospital Employees Union, whose employees, many of whom had just had their living wage jobs turned into poverty wage jobs through contracting out. So they were already working on this issue for their members. So the findings from this review and research group were reviewed then by the Living Wage Roundtable that we had pulled together. We took it out to more focus groups with low-income parents, and Van City helped us convene a focus group with business owners or employers also, because we really wanted the calculation to be bulletproof, conservative, make sure it had credibility with a variety of groups. So having done all of that, we produced finally a report called Working for a Living Wage, focused particularly on Vancouver and Victoria. It outlines the rationale, the principles, for setting regional living wage standards. What are the significant benefits for employees? What are the significant benefits for employers to become living wage employers? And then we released that report and then established an advisory committee to start the campaign. Again, recruiting some of these allies to be part of a campaign strategy, and we started fundraising, and by 2009 we were able to hire our first living wage organizer, campaign organizer. So that's who we are. And so a little brief history in the international context. About 20 years ago, there was a living wage campaign in Baltimore, Maryland that was started by some unions and some church folks, and it caught the attention of activists around the country. It looked like a way to address the issue that so many people were still poor even though they were working. So since then, a lot has been accomplished in the United States, for instance, and in other places. So just to highlight, across the U.S., more than 150 living wage ordinances, or we might call them bylaws, have been adopted in cities and counties. They've learned that this stimulates their local economy and is one of the best antidotes to the demise of local businesses. Then if we look to London, UK, where the London Olympics, 2010 Olympics, were a living wage Olympics, that's thanks to the movement there. The major employers there have signed on to the campaign, which has a good decade behind it now. Banks, universities have all signed on, and political leaders across the left-right spectrum are supporting it at the municipal and the national level. The UK living wage calculation is institutionalized in the Greater London Authority, so it's actually worked on by government, and there's a living wage foundation now in the UK that supports and recognizes living wage employers. So living wage is one tool to tackle poverty. It's complementary also to strategies for like raising the minimum wage, and it opens up conversations and has in all of these settings about children's right to healthy development and the role of both public and private employers who want to do something to improve the health of their employees and the health of their communities. And it also highlights the pressure on employers to make up for failures in public policy, such as the lack of affordable housing or lack of affordable quality childcare, which puts pressure on wages then to go up to accommodate those expenses. In Canada now, what's been happening over the last few years, both public and private sector employers and municipalities across Canada have been working towards adopting living wage policies. And those leaders, as we've talked, or various people working together, have identified the value of developing a national framework, a Canadian living wage framework. That would include a consistent living wage definition, a consistent calculation methodology, and a consistent or shared strategy for recognizing corporations and employers and community leaders who want to adopt a living wage policy. So there is this national framework. It is on the Living Wage Canada website that, again, incorporates these definitions and calculations and the principles and other resources that we hope communities across the country, as they take up living wage campaigns in their local communities, will adopt and support this consistency, because the benefits of consistency across the country are many. To standardize the calculation allows living wage estimates to be meaningful across jurisdictions or comparisons between different communities, so people know that you're not just randomly picking a number. It increases the credibility of the campaign when we're approaching policymakers or employers who want to consider becoming living wage employers. It allows employers who operate in multiple jurisdictions to know that there will be certainty that the benchmark will be meaningful across the different locations that they operated in. So again, that achieving consistency lowers some of the barriers to employers who want to become living wage employers and strengthens the credibility of the local campaign in all of our communities if we can stay on the same page. Here in BC, a brief history. In Metro Vancouver, we now have approximately 40 employers, or almost 40 employers signed on as living wage employers that we have certified through the Metro Vancouver campaign, and we've now developed partnerships with both Greater Victoria and the Fraser Valley campaigns, so that because we realize that that's the bulk, that would capture the bulk of the population and employers in the province, so we would reach significant proportion of them if we can really strengthen the campaign in those three places. So we have collaborative agreements with those, but one of our goals with this webinar today is, of course, to also support campaigns in other parts of British Columbia and, of course, other parts of Canada to look at how you might start a living wage campaign yourself. So I'll turn it over to Iglika. She's going to walk you through.
Thank you, Adrienne. So how is the living wage calculated? The living wage is the hourly amount that two working parents working full-time have to earn in order to support a family with two children. So the living wage is based on the actual expenses that this family will have in the community where they live, their actual cost of housing, their actual cost of transportation, actual cost of childcare, and so on. It also incorporates all the government benefits that the family would be eligible for, things like the Canada Child Tax benefit, GST credits if the family is eligible for them, and so on. And accounts for all the taxes the family will need to pay, including federal and provincial taxes, CPP premiums, and EI premiums. Now, the living wage calculation is different from the minimum wage. The living wage is a higher standard. It is a wage which will lift the family out of poverty and will provide a basic level of economic security. The family that we base this calculation on is, as this picture shows, family of four. And the living wage calculation, however, will also support a family throughout the life cycle, including young adults who don't have children yet, because we believe very strongly that the wages before should not discourage them from having children. So wages should be high enough that you could foresee, reasonably having children and supporting them. And for older adults, as they age, the living wage will provide a little bit of extra income to save for retirement or meet other expenses. So in most communities, the living wage calculated on the basis of the two-parent, two-child family will also be sufficient to meet the needs of a single parent with one child. The only exception at the moment is the Metro Vancouver area, where the living wage is not adequate for a single parent with one child. And if you want to know why, I suggest that you take a look at the living wage update that we publish every year. Is that not loud enough?
A little louder.
A little louder. Okay, I will project. So families with two children. What is the family budget including? The family budget includes the basics that the family would need to have a basic, decent quality of life. You see a list of 10 basic expenses we use: food, clothing and footwear, shelter, transportation, childcare, MSP premiums, non-MSP healthcare costs, so things that would not be covered by MSP, like prescription drugs. Parents' education, this is enough for the parents to take 2 courses in 1 year at a community college to upgrade their education and get better jobs. Contingency fund, which is equal to 2 weeks of earnings for each parent to cover unexpected circumstances like serious illness or transition time between jobs if one of the parents should lose their job. And other household expenses, which covers things like furniture, soap, school supplies, and very basic level of entertainment. So you see, this is a budget that will lift the family out of poverty. However, it is a very bare bones budget and does not provide any extras that many of us take for granted. There is no money here to save for retirement or for your children's education. There's no money to deal with any credit card debt or student debt the parents may have. There is no money to deal with a serious emergency or a serious illness that lasts more than 2 weeks. So it is still a very bare bones budget. And finally, I just want to emphasize what Adrienne said. It's very important that the methodology is kept consistent, and we do not try to calculate living wages for single individuals or for different family configurations. The two-parent, two-child family is ingrained in is agreed upon in the national framework for the living wage through vibrant communities. And if you want to calculate the living wage in your community, I strongly encourage you to do it for the two-parent, two-child family. And over to Adrienne.
So one of the both beautiful and challenging aspects of the campaign is its grassroots nature. So yes, there's a national network now starting of people engaged in this work, but the local campaigns across the country have really sprung up where community advocates arise or are able to to take this up, want to take it up, and have found the resources to support themselves to do that, sometimes as volunteers and sometimes through their community work or their other work. So in Metro Vancouver, we've been fortunate because we have a partner in the CCPA BC office to calculate the living wage. We do it annually. We publish every April. But the CCPA doesn't have the ability to, Iglika is going to show you the calculator, and that's been awesome to be able to use. But the CCPA doesn't have the resource itself to do the calculation for every single community that might want to get started. So our suggestion to you, if you're interested in and don't have a platform to do this yet in your community, is find a local resource person, local agency that might have some research or technical expertise or a mandate to do some kind of community impact measurements. It might something they count. It might be the local community foundation. It might be a community planning council. It could be a chapter of a local trade union. It might have some research capacity. There could be a municipal planning table that meets, or a local health authority. Sometimes it's been, in BC, it's been community developers who have a mandate to go out and look at the social determinants of health and do some work around that in the health field. So there's a variety of things to look at. Could be if you can find a champion in your local board of trade or chamber of commerce. If you can find someone who'll take it up there and offer some staff or volunteer time. Because you'll need to ask around and look at all of these things. The need is to find your local data. That's your housing prices, as your transportation costs, your childcare costs, your food costs, as Iglika has outlined, and find that local data, plug it into the calculator. CCPA will be able to help you check the methodology once that's done, but they don't have the power or the person power to go around and collect the data for you. So we do have a guide online, local government policy toolkit, that might help you think about how you would navigate this, who you might look to talk to, and where you can find an ally or the resources to take this on in. Across the country, local advocates are finding resources to do this. They have in a number of communities, and some of you probably from those communities. And so we are becoming a fairly robust network, and that has value too because we're sharing across these practice phone calls that Tamarack Communities organizes. So living wage practice phone calls, so that we can share what we're learning, where we're finding allies, what's working, what's not, what's the methodology look like. And we have found that the BC methodology is the most transparent and the easiest to apply at the local level. So you're in good company if you want to take this up, and if you haven't already, the more communities that spring up to develop this local living wage campaign, the stronger our movement will be.
All right, so let's walk through the calculation. Now that we have convinced you that you should calculate the living wage for your own community. So this is how the calculation is constructed. As you see, we need to come up with the living wage so that the annual family expenses equal to the available income to the family after government transfers and taxes. So how are you going to do this? As Adrienne mentioned, we do provide a lot of resources on our website. So the first thing I suggest you do is go to www.policyalternatives.ca/livingwage2014. This is what the page looks like, and this is what you're going to find there. At the bottom, the living wage calculation guide and the living wage calculation spreadsheet. These are the two documents that you will need to calculate your own community's living wage. So let's start with the calculation spreadsheet. It is an Excel spreadsheet, and it explains, there's notes in it that explain exactly what you need to do in order to calculate your own living wage. The only thing you need to do is find the family expenses for your local community to plug into the shaded cells in the spreadsheet. So as you will see, some of the family expenses you don't even need to worry about. Things like MSP that are the same province-wide, it's automatically included in the calculation spreadsheet. You don't have to worry about it. All you have to worry about is the calculation, the cells that are shaded. So one thing to note about this spreadsheet, it has two tabs at the bottom. If it's the first time you're calculating the living wage, make sure you're working with the tab that says First Time Living Wage Calculation. If you have calculated the living wage calculation before, there's another tab. This is the one we use for Greater Vancouver. The only difference is that when you use last year's living wage income, this is what's used as the basis of calculating the government transfers you're eligible for and government taxes, because in reality, this is how taxes and transfers are calculated. You pay them based on last year's income. So that's the only difference. But you need to use the first step. So let's take a closer look now at what you will need to find. You will need to find food, clothing, footwear, shelter, transportation, childcare, non-MSP health expenses, and parents' education. So you will see that in our table, the first 5 expenses, there is a title above called Modified MBM. This stands for the Market Basket Measure, the Statistics Canada calculates. Now, the good news is that most of these family expenses you will need come from already prepared reports from independent agencies like Statistics Canada, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, the Dietitians of Canada, or other such groups. So we use a lot of them based on the market basket measure that Statistics Canada defines, because they are solidly calculated, they're updated annually, and they're hard to argue with. So this gives the calculation a lot more credibility. But how are you going to go about finding these numbers for your community? Because the numbers in the calculation spreadsheet here are for Metro Vancouver. Where to find the local stats? Well, download the living wage calculation guide from our website, and it will walk you step by step through how you will find all the family expenses you need. Now, this is quite a dense document. It should be used as reference material. It's not something you will read from the first page to the last page in one go. It's something that you have to keep on your desk and keep referring to as you go through the calculation. So let's take a look, for example, if you want to calculate the cost of food, what will the calculation guide tell us? And I'm going to actually go to the calculation guide and show you what you will see when you open it. So you should be able to see my screen now. Can you, Catherine, can we see? Make sure that they can see it. Yes. Okay, so this is the calculation guide, just as you see on the website. If I scroll down, family expenses start on page 6, so let's go to page 6. Page 6, explains what the family composition is, how many children, all the rest of the things you need to know. But here it tells us under food that the information you need comes from a report of the Dietitians of Canada, the BC region, called the Cost of Eating in BC. And even provides a link which you can use to go on the website and download the report. It then explains in step-by-step how you will use these numbers, which are for 2011, to update for inflation using Statistics Canada Consumer Price Index numbers from this table for the food amount, so inflation based on food consumer price index, and how you will calculate the amount of food costs that a family of 4 in your community will need. So let's go back to the presentation slides and see what this looks like. This is the report. This is what it looks like, the cost of eating in BC. Again, the numbers are for 2011, and you'll find that a lot of the numbers you need to calculate the local living wage will be slightly older than what you need, so you will need to apply inflation adjustments, and the calculation guide will explain how. So the cost of eating in BC...
Still seeing page 1.
Okay. There must be some people might be having glitches, because I can see here you're seeing the other page. So the cost of food varies widely by health authority. And I have one figure from the dietitian's report that shows you there's almost $100 a month difference in the cost of food between Interior Health and Vancouver Coastal Health authorities. So this is why it is very important that we use local numbers when we calculate the living wage. And also important because these numbers change every year to update the calculation every year. The same for shelter. If you go, and I won't do that right now because we don't have a lot of time. If you go through the calculation guide for shelter, it will send you to this report by the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation The report is called Advancing Affordable Housing Solutions, and twice a year it provides data on median housing rent costs by community, by province. So one thing I should note here that we use median. So median is the number when if you order all the rent costs from the smallest to the largest, is the number in the middle. So half of all rents are smaller and half of all rents are larger. It usually is considerably lower than the average rent costs because in Metro Vancouver and many other areas, high-end luxury rental properties put pressure on the average and move the average up. So it's not reflective of what modest family housing might cost. So we use the median numbers. Here's the table from this report, and you can see that there are more than 20 different communities in BC that CMHC reports on. So this is a great resource for you to use, and what you need to use here is level 3, the last column, because this is the median. This is how they calculate the median rent. And if you do not live in one of those communities listed, it will be a lot more difficult for you to find a reliable number for housing. So if that's the case, you would need to do your own survey based on locally available rents, and I would be happy to assist you. So contact us if you are not able to find reported rents for your communities from this report. But as you see, many communities will be able to. So transportation costs, one note I wanted to make here is that the transportation costs that we use in the living wage calculation include the cost of owning and operating a car as calculated by Statistics Canada for the market basket measure. And they provide the cost of owning a car, including insurance, driver's licensing fees, the regular tune-ups that they're required within a year, they estimate, and 1,500 liters of gas. So this is your standard cost for owning a car. So the guide will explain, again, where to get it from. Expenses you will need to source. There's a question here that the MBM, the last available number, is 2010. What we need to do here is to apply the respective consumer price index. So as I mentioned, for food, we apply the consumer price index for food, calculated by Statistics Canada, to adjust for inflation since 2010. Again, for the owning and operating a car, Statistics Canada produces consumer price index for owning and operating a car, how much the cost change every year. So you apply the specific consumer price index adjustment, and the guide explains that. The expenses you will need to find that won't come from Statistics Canada or CMHC reports are the following: tenant insurance, child care fee, and parents' education. So again, the guide will tell you where to find them. Let's take a look, for example, quickly at the guide and what tells you about child care fees. So we're going to open the guide and scroll through to child care fees. And let me see if I can make it a little bit bigger for you to read it from your computer. But it basically tells you that we're using full-time daycare costs for the 4-year-old, before and after school care for the 7-year-old for the school year, and then summer care, 1 month and 2 weeks of summer care. And it explains that you will be able to find estimates of childcare expenses through contacting your regional childcare referral centers, which would either have surveys of childcare providers or will be able to connect you with some so you can do your own small survey. So this is how the guide would help you as you're trying to find your own calculation.
People say you're breaking up a little bit, so perhaps a little more volume.
Okay, I will try to use my louder voice, my big voice. So parent education, what you need here is the cost of taking 2 courses in a community college in a year. So what you would do is call your local community college and get the costs of taking 2 courses. Don't forget that those come with student fees that you need to include in the costing as well, and an estimate of textbook costs, because those can be very expensive. So these are the only 3 expenses you will need to source. The calculation guide, as I mentioned, has tips for you. So what do you do once you have the family expenses? Now we get to the fun part where you get to plug it into the calculator. And now I'll get rid of these presentation slides now and show you how to plug it into the calculator. Unfortunately, we don't have time for me to actually go through a numbers and let me just see how to, and look up the numbers for a specific community from the market basket measure, adjust them for inflation for you, or do all the numbers right now. But what I have here is a spreadsheet with the Fraser Valley calculation. So I will just copy and paste the Fraser Valley expenses into the Vancouver spreadsheet so that you will see how you will operate the spreadsheet once you have all the numbers. So my first piece of advice is when you start working with the spreadsheet you download from the website, save it as a new document so that you have a clean copy, because you will make mistakes and you will have to go back to the beginning. And it's really important to have a clean copy that you can revert to. Okay, so you should be able to see my screen. I have Vancouver on the right-hand side, Fraser Valley on the left-hand side. And I'm just going to copy and paste the shaded areas, which are the only things we need to change. I just want to paste it. Copy, paste, and then here, copy, paste. All right, so let's take a look at this now. We no longer need. So here we have the spreadsheet with the new family expenses. Wait, there's something wrong here. What is happening? Okay, sorry. It's not working. Okay, no, never mind. No, nothing is wrong. It's all perfect. So we see that the total family expenses for the family in the Fraser Valley is almost $59,000 a year, right? So we go down to the living wage expenses, government deduction and taxes. And you see there's 2 shaded cells here. And this is the only thing you need to tweak that is a little bit more complicated. And it is that the federal and provincial governments have education tax credits. So you get a tax credit for the amount of tuition fees you pay. And because we have tuition fees embedded in the parents' education amount, the formula in this cell has the Vancouver tuition costs. So you will need to change it to reflect your actual tuition costs in your community. So let's start here. The tuition costs are this part of the formula. You will know this by reading the calculation guide, which explains. And I happen to know here that in the Fraser Valley, this is the correct tuition. So I put it in. I press enter, and it automatically calculates the provincial income tax with the Fraser Valley tuition credits. I have to do it federally as well because this tax is also a federal tax credit. So here is my tuition, and I input the numbers for your community and press enter. And the only other thing is that federally there's also a public transit tax credit. So here we have the public transit cost in Vancouver. Again, if you read the calculation guide, it will tell you that this is what it is. And I will replace it with the public transit cost in your community. If you have transit, if there is no transit in your community, you will just delete it from the formula. Okay, so now we have updated the income taxes. and we're ready to calculate the living wage. This is the most fun and exciting step for me anyways. So we need to look at this table 3 here, family income less family expenses, because what we're trying to do is to make sure that the annual family expenses are equal to the annual family income. In this case, because we have the Vancouver living wage in this spreadsheet, we see that the available family income is higher than the expenses. So this wage is too high for the local community. We know this because this cell here, C41, which is the gap, is very large. There's very large difference between income and expense. So what you need to do is go here to the cell B48, which is the wage, and change it manually to a lower amount. And you do this until you get family income to match family expenses. Let's demonstrate. So suppose I lower it to $19. Again, C41 here, we have a very large gap. Family income is still higher than expenses. The living wage must be made smaller. So put $18. Still have a positive gap. Income is higher than expenses. We need to get it low. $17. Now we see that actual family income is less than family expenses. So we have negative, this family has negative $33 for the year. We don't like to have negative dollars for the family. We want them to be able to meet all their expenses. So we're going to increase this wage until we get the books to balance and income covers expenses. So let's say I increase it by 1 cent. It's not enough. The family income is now only $10.61 less than expenses, but it's still less than expenses, so the wage needs to be higher. So I make it $17.02, and voila, family income covers all family expenses, $12.10. And then you could go back and check, this indeed is the Fraser Valley living wage, $17.02. Now, when you get the family income to balance, there's just one more step before you're completely done. And it is to check, oops, my number is actually wrong here. It is to check the amount of subsidy from this here provincial child care subsidy. Here's the issue. The provincial government provides child care subsidy for low-income families to cover part of the cost of child care. However, the way they're calculated is based on your income. So it's impossible to put it in the spreadsheet as a formula because it becomes circular. The subsidy depends on the living wage and the living wage depends on the subsidy. So you have to do it manually, and the guide explains this. But you basically need to look at cells H40 and H41, which is the amount of subsidy the family would qualify for. And in this case, they are both negative. So you do not qualify for a subsidy. But if, in your case, if the living wage is lower than $17.02 in your community, you might qualify for a subsidy. And if one of these numbers here, H40 or H41, is positive, you need to go to the guide and it will explain to you how to incorporate the amount of subsidy your family would receive in the calculation. And that's it. You're done. You have your living wage. So let's go back to our slides. Whoops, that's not the slides. Now we have time for questions.
Thanks, Iglika. That was great and interesting and highly detailed. And so I'm monitoring the chat line here. If folks have questions, if you want to type them into the chat bar, and I'll read them out, and Iglika and Adrienne will happily answer them.
In the meantime, I would say that, if you are trying to calculate the living wage, your first step would probably be to get in touch with the Living Wage for Families campaign. Just to inquire if someone else in your community may be already doing this work. The Living Wage campaign will be able to tell you if there is someone else locally and connect you. And if not, please download the calculation guide and spreadsheet provided. And if you have any questions, contact me, and our contact information is in those documents so you can easily find it.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions that are coming in, Iglika. One was someone noted that the market basket measures have not been updated since 2010. I think you addressed that.
I believe the last time they were updated actually is 2011, but I don't have my numbers before. But yeah, a lot of these numbers are a little bit old, and you will have to update for inflation. But here's one thing I want to emphasize is that when we do these updates for inflation, we update not with the general CPI number, like the overall inflation number, but with specific inflation rate for, say, food, or inflation rate for owning and operating a vehicle, or inflation rate for utilities. It is important to calculate the living wage every year from scratch based on the local cost of rent, childcare, and all the rest of it. And you can't just calculate it 1 year and then update it for inflation using the general inflation number, because in our experience calculating the living wage in Vancouver, in Metro Vancouver here since 2008, we find that every year the living wage increases by more than the general inflation, because the cost of the basics that the family needs, shelter, childcare more specifically, but also transportation, are rising at a higher rate than overall general inflation. So don't apply just overall general inflation to the wage and call it done. You actually have to go through the process to do it every year.
Thanks, Iglika. There's a couple questions here for, and if anyone thinks they can go through this themselves, how much time, person hours or time, would it take to do a first-time calculation? What are people looking at here?
It depends on how comfortable you are with spreadsheets and with looking up numbers from government documents. If you're fairly comfortable, I would say it isn't a huge time commitment. The biggest time commitment would be probably around finding the childcare costs in your local community, because those are ones that won't come from a report that you will have to go to a community. But I would say maybe a week's worth of work full-time, and you will have a calculation.
So one person full-time for a week?
Yeah.
And then you'll check their calculation.
And I'm happy to check calculations. You can email me, you can call me if you have questions that you don't understand the specific formula, you think there's an error in the spreadsheet, feel free to call me and I will try to sort it out.
And then the second year, after the calculation was done the first year, how long would it take someone to recalculate?
It's considerably less time, because you now know exactly where to go for all the numbers.
So a day or two?
Yeah, I would say a day or two.
Okay. Folks have asked if the presentation will be available. Yes, it'll get posted on both of our websites after this webinar, so you'll be able to see the notes. Another question here is, Iglika, could you quickly explain again, or Adrienne, why we use the 4-person family unit, the 2 parents, the 2 children? Why is that the notional family for this rate?
Well, we wanted to look at families. I think Adrienne mentioned that in the presentation, because it's very important. The environment in which children grow up, it has permanent, almost permanent impacts on their lives. And so we want to make sure that we're dealing with issues like child poverty. And we pick a family of 4 because this is the most common family unit in BC. 2 children, not 1, not 3. And it's important that the living wage can support a family of 4. And we pick young children, ages 4 and 7, so they both need childcare. So this is one of the more expensive times in the life of a family, is when the children are young and they need childcare. But we did not pick the most expensive years, which are infant toddler childcare. So under the age of 3 is when childcare is more expensive. So our children in our model family have cheaper childcare needs, but still we wanted to have a wage that works for almost every family type. It works for very young children, it works as the children grow up, because it's important to have just one number. We can't specify, and your wage can't depend on how old your children are or how many children you have. That's not something we can do. So we thought we'd pick a more common family type that will meet the needs of everyone in some way.
Here's another question about the guide, Iglika. It says that it's very important to choose variables at a point in the year. Do you have any guidance at what is the appropriate point in the year? And maybe you can talk about when we do the annual announcement.
Yeah, in Metro Vancouver, we do the annual announcement of the living wage in the end of April. And so we usually use the costs or family expenses, so things like rent or childcare, from the year before. So the 2014 living wage for Metro Vancouver includes the 2013 rent cost and 2013 childcare cost, transportation. So we usually pick those that are in effect as of December 2013, closest as possible. Some of them say the market basket measure, whoever looked it up has noted that it gets updated once a year. So you would update it to 2013, it'll be a year. But the rental surveys from CMHC get produced twice a year, in the spring and in the fall. So we use the fall one because it's closest to our date. So I would use the most recent numbers available up to the end of the year.
Here's a question about one of the data sets, Iglika. Someone has asked if the Dietitians of Canada have any publications that might point out the cost of food across the country.
I'm not sure about other provinces, and that's actually a very good question. I wanted to make sure that people are aware that one of the things that the calculation spreadsheet does in its value is that it automatically will calculate the taxes and transfers for the family. So you don't have to mess with them. But those are based on BC provincial tax rates and federal tax rates. So in Canada, taxes vary quite dramatically by province. So you cannot use this spreadsheet as it is to calculate the living wage in Manitoba or, in Saskatchewan, in another province, because the provincial tax rates would be different. So this is for BC, and I do not know of other reports about cost of food or cost of rent in other provinces. I would say get in touch with the Vibrant Communities, the National Living Wage Framework, and they might be able to point you to folks who are doing calculations for your province, because right now there's calculations in a lot of the provinces. So someone already has looked at that and might be able to give you a better answer.
Okay, this is kind of a related question from someone in a northern community where they found the food guide was not applicable because of the very high cost of food in those communities, or in communities that are resource extracting communities in the north and are also tourist destinations. The costs of food are quite high. Do you have any suggestions for them?
Yeah, if you live in a community where the cost of something like food or shelter or anything really, you believe that the standard numbers that you see in the reports do not reflect your local reality. Use numbers that you believe reflect the experiences of families in your community. So you would need to do some sort of a survey of what a more appropriate amount would be. And it is a lot more involved and it will take more time. So I would suggest try to find partners with either local planning councils, municipal planning tables, or university-based academics, and they might be able to help you because you are looking at something a lot more difficult than using the standard reports that work in most of the province.
You could try contacting there are provincial networks of nutritionists and dietitians, and maybe you can find a local dietitian or nutritionist who would familiarize themselves or may already know how the basket of food for different or the costing for each individual age group and stuff is done, and then you'd have to do it for your local community. So maybe they'd walk with you to do that, or take some time, because it means actually going to the grocery store and costing out. We know this is what a healthy diet for a 4-year-old looks like. These are the basic items that need to go in there. So you might find some partnership from a local dietitian or nutritionist through maybe the health authority.
There's another question going back to the family of 4, asking whether it would be possible to calculate the living wage for a single young person that didn't have childcare. I mean, I guess in theory, it's possible to do. Partly this campaign is practical and pragmatic with limited resources. How can we find a representative number that works for most people most of the time? One of the living wage campaigns in Ontario, I think the Halton and Hamilton group, actually calculated 3 different living wages, one for the family of 4 we've seen, one for a lone parent household with one child and one for a single person's household. And in fact, the living wage for a single household for a young person was calculated to be higher, because although you've taken out the childcare costs, you don't have the economies of scale around housing. And so that has given us comfort that the living wage, although it's calculated on a family of four, serves as a good number no matter the family situation. Is that fair, Iglika?
I would say that that's fair. There's also specific government tax credits and benefits for families with children. So if you're a single person, you would not be getting the Canada Child Tax benefit. You wouldn't be getting tax credits around children. So it does, I would think, even out in some way. But it is important not to produce it, because suppose it was lower or higher, it doesn't matter. If it was different and the employers could sign up and say, okay, if you're single, we'll pay you that much, and if you have children, you pay that much, then you start having huge problems and concerns with even human rights, because the employer then says, well, I don't really want to hire parents because parents are more expensive, so why don't they just hire singles? And then, then you run afoul of human rights,
Absolutely.
and you just can't do that. So that's why we just picked one that we believe would work for everyone more or less.
And as we know, employees are not required to tell their employers what their financial obligations are. You could be supporting a single person is supporting an aging relative, a disabled relative, paying off student debt, all kinds of things that make the living wage really important to you. So that kind of stereotype of, oh, you don't have many costs, you're just a young person working, doesn't always apply.
Here's a different kind of question and a good observation. Someone's written in and said this seems to be quite a political issue, and do we have any, can we speak to any effective practices in impacting public policy? I mean, I think it's important to us to understand that this is a voluntary market response to that failure of public policy. So yes, it is a political campaign, and that's why for us at the Living Wage Campaign, we're also work very closely with the Poverty Reduction Coalition in here in BC, advocating for public policy changes. We know that if there was an affordable childcare strategy in the province, or if people didn't have to make the individual contributions to their medical services plan. In fact, if there was an effective childcare policy, the living wage would be reduced by $4 an hour. If there was no individual requirement to contribute to MSP premiums, the living wage would be reduced by $1 an hour. So they go very much together. They're two sides of the same issue about tackling poverty. Any other comments?
No.
Absolutely. I think that's very important, that the living wage is when expenses are met by your income. So if you have higher expenses for childcare because we don't have affordable childcare, then the employer will have to pay a higher wage. If we had a public program providing subsidized childcare, your employer will have to pay a lower wage. And the Living Wage for Families campaign, on their website, you can actually find calculators that show exactly how public policy changes would lower the living wage. So that's something we tell small businesses who say, I can't possibly pay the living wage of $17 in the Fraser Valley or $20.10 in Vancouver, but we say then you should be supporting the calls for affordability, policies that improve family affordability, like childcare, like affordable housing, like eliminating the MSP premium.
It also, in this campaign, part of the political campaigning is also around the costs, making visible the costs of not paying living wages, of having families raised, and from First Call's perspective, especially children being raised in poverty. So there are costs to that, and the CCPA has done costing on that. I think Ontario's got some costing. There's some national costing on that we regularly point out both to employers that we're in conversation with, or to governments or municipalities that are considering this. There are costs in the local community, and certainly to provincial budgets, like healthcare is a big one, or lost productivity, or education costs, or criminal justice costs, when you don't address the issue of families trying to raise their kids in poverty. So huge costs there that are marginalized sometimes, and that families are just supposed to suck it up, but actually the whole community pays when we're not addressing family health and children's health.
We have a practical question that came in a bit earlier, and Iglika, could you use the mortgage calculation in place of the rent? I think that's a bit of a tricky question, but is there an easy answer to that?
Well, one of the assumptions, I guess, in the Metro Vancouver, at least model family, is that the family rents, because in Metro Vancouver, the prices of housing are such that, you know, if your family could afford to buy, probably we wouldn't worry about it. But most young families rent. And so if in your community, and I know that sometimes in rural areas it is the case that almost nobody's renting and you kind of have to buy property, then I guess you would have to do that. But I'm not sure how you would do that, because the cost of mortgage also depends on down payments or how much you were able to save.
Yeah, but a person's circumstances might have changed. They might have had a down payment at one point in time, be in a mortgage situation, and now be working at a low-wage job. I think what people can bear in terms of a monthly mortgage is probably equivalent to what people can bear in terms of monthly rent at low-wage jobs.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, obviously this is a bit of a generalization. This living wage calculation won't fit absolutely every family. I mean, we use the median numbers, we use some estimate of childcare. It's not a guarantee, even if that's the median childcare amount, it's not a guarantee that you will be able to find the space at that cost. You know, your mileage may vary, so to speak, but as general practice.
I think we've got we're getting close to the end of the hour. There's one more question that's just come in that asks about what happens to positions above an entry level. How are employers that are adopting or looking at the living wage, how are they dealing with the issue of what happens at pay bands just above the living wage?
I'm not sure. So what happened? Are we talking about wage compression?
We're talking about wage compression.
Okay, so in a unionized workforce or where there's a wage grid, well, I think we have a point of view in the campaign that this is a anti-poverty campaign, and we're trying to address the issue of family poverty, child and family poverty, individuals poverty. And so if bringing up the lowest paid workers on a grid or in a collective agreement compresses the wage, brings them closer up to the next highest paid employer, it's really not the campaign's concern, to be frank, that the grid needs to have a certain distance between steps. That's for collective bargaining to play out, or if it's a collective agreement issue, or for employers to look at their wage grids too. But I think there's a really strong message that everybody deserves and has a right to a standard of living that allows them to not be living in chronic financial stress, and that's what a living wage is designed to do. That's a primary objective of this, and that's the moral basis, if you'd like, on which we found it. How that affects higher income earners is a different question, I would say, and we would hope that people would be interested in seeing the floor raised for those at the bottom, and then they can worry about whether they need the distance between the next one.
Thanks, Adrienne. We've got a couple more questions, but we're out of booked time for the webinar. This will be published. We on the Living Wage for Families campaign website, as well as on the Canadian, all three places. And you will find email and phone numbers at each of those places to contact us for more information. When we close out the webinar, you'll get a short survey. We're extremely interested in your feedback. This is the first time we've done it, and we'd like to know if we should do it again, and if we do it again, what changes would you recommend, if any? So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for your interest. Bye-bye.